is August 25th. Yes, August 25th. Gathered from Vietnam and Tokyo, and we are discussing European history. And making not only history but European and Japanese culture. And we have looked at, we're trying to get a better understanding of the European way of thinking. Now, Europe is a very big continent, so there are a lot of differences even within Europe, and we are of course talking about archetypes, but we have a shared experience. We have a cultural inheritance which molds Europeans in their thinking and in their doing. Therefore, I think it makes sense to get a better understanding of the roots of Europeans, to better understand them, and therefore to be capable of engaging with Europeans on a deeper level. So we looked at history.
You share slide.
Yes, of course. Let me. Why are you so big?
Do you know how this?
Let me maybe like this.
Okay. No, you can do that.
Here.
Can you?
Yeah. This is shared.
No, up. No, this one. Top line. This one. Yeah.
Ponk. All right.
So where did you click that to get showing this one?
Actually, it is full screen.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we looked at history. We looked at the Roman Empire, Middle Ages, Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, colonialization, war history, Cold War, and European Union. And then we went on to look at, here we go, Confucianism, and we compared Confucianism with Western philosophy. So basically, what is Western philosophy? A quick repetition. Basically, it is a metaphysical understanding the fundamental nature. It is epistemology, the nature and the scope of knowledge. This is a more abstract way of thinking, and very fundamental questions. Is what I see around me, is that actually real? Do I actually exist? These fundamental questions can be answered in different ways. We saw that they can be answered in a completely abstract way, without observation of the world around us, in the way that Descartes did. He concluded. He questioned everything. He really questioned, like, okay, does this thing exist? How do I know it exists? Why it can be a figment of my imagination? Is what I observe here the same what you observe, or do we just have a common definition for the object that we see? And this is not new. Plato already had thoughts about this, and made descriptions about a case where prisoners were held in a cave and could only see the world as shadows on the wall, and therefore he said, well, basically sometimes what we see as reality is not actually real. There could be a deeper reality. So our lives should be dedicated to finding the truth, finding what is real. Epistemology is tapping into that. Descartes questioned everything, and then but he was looking for the pure, the basic proof of the question whether he existed, and he couldn't prove anything. He couldn't prove that he existed until he realized that the only thing that he knew that was real was that there were doubts, there were questions, that he was not sure about there was something was not sure about anything. Therefore, because he had doubts, he knew that he must exist, because otherwise he would not have doubts. So that was became. I think, therefore I am, is a quote from Descartes, and that sounds very esoteric, but based on that understanding, because he existed, he tried to prove that God existed, and the world around him actually did exist, without looking at the reality, but purely reasoning. Through pure reason, he tried to establish that things actually exist. That is something that in metaphysics, in epistemology, and in value theory is more focused on, and that is actually what Western philosophers have in common with Confucius, is more, okay, how should we live? How can we become better human beings? How should we organize ourselves to create a healthy society? That is the value theory. The thing that unites all these different streams within philosophy is that it's tied together with logic. Every philosopher is basically using logic to come to a conclusion. There is also, there are voices that we hear among philosophers, that they have always been categorized in as liberal arts or more soft sciences, but actually it's a very hard science, because it's pure reasoning, it's pure logic, and it should belong in the sciences department, not in the liberal arts. So that way of reasoning, deduction, induction, abduction, those techniques, they are very fundamental in European society today, and they have their roots in philosophy. We looked at history of philosophy. We looked at how they were actually interlinked, like Pythagoras. We know him from mathematics, but he was actually also a philosopher. He had his own school, and he tried to find mathematical proof and support for what he observed. He also tried to prove that God was more or less basically God could be found through mathematics, could be proven by mathematics. Socrates, we looked at Socrates, the father of modern philosophy. Socrates, mainly known because of his questioning technique, the Socratic method. Basically, we should question everything. Socrates claimed not to know anything, therefore he questioned everything. He tried to find whether people's beliefs were actually true or not, and by doing that, and by questioning them, and by basically disproving of commonly held beliefs, he upset a lot of people, and he was convicted to the death sentence. But he had a large following, and one of his followers, Plato, and Plato was so impressed with him that he made him the main character of all of his books. He wrote a lot. He wrote a lot about his experiences with Socrates, and Socrates is basically the starting point where philosophers are basically putting reason in the first place. Reason in the sense that philosophy is aimed at finding the truth. And no matter what the outcome is, if the conclusion should be derived logically from the premises. So that is there were, like, for example, in the time, the era of Pythagoras, which was before Socrates, people who proved actually that Pythagoras' theories were not exactly consistent and could be falsified. They were some of them were killed, and so that is since Socrates that has been that has changed. Plato is a we know, for example, Plato became especially famous for many things, but I think one of the things that was his book, The Republic. He is more of a theoretical philosopher. He observed, for example, in Athens, that when it came to politics, not always the best argument won, and that made him furious. He said, okay, people are not capable of living in a democratic society. Not everybody should be allowed to vote. That should be better left to the philosophers, because only philosophers have a deeper understanding. Only philosophers can think straight without being blurred, clouded by emotions. Philosophers are the only ones who can truly deduct and find the truth. Therefore, the philosophers should rule the country. Aristotle was a contemporary of Plato, but went his own way. He was also the teacher of Alexander the Great. He was more pragmatic. He also observed, like Plato, that not always the best argument won, but instead of rejecting people who were not philosophers, he actually wrote a book on how to persuade people with not only logical argumentation, but also with an appeal to moral values and with persuasive methods. The art of rhetoric was invented by Socrates. Sorry, not Socrates, Aristotle. And Aristotle also wrote a book on how to write a story, a good story for a play, for example. So Aristotle was much more of an ethical philosopher, and his writings are still very much in use today. When I'm into public speaking, and still the lessons of Aristotle stand tall today. We looked at deduction. That's basically deriving a conclusion based on logical argumentation. All men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. Is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Is a deduction. Induction is a conclusion based on probability, on observation. It doesn't rely on a premise that is 100% fact, because that's the limitation of deduction. For example, induction, if prices increase, demand falls, is based on induction, because we have observed that very often. So increasing prices leads to reduction in demand. So in economics, we inducted that there is a relationship between the two. Abduction is that's what we know from, for example, our crime television, where we see the inspectors, like Inspector Colombo, to try to find the truth through reasoning by abducting. Basically, how give a good example of abduction. So you need to disprove all the other possibilities. If you want to find the murderer, then you need to make sure that you can have your suspicion deduct, for example, that because this rich man had died, who has killed him, and a police officer would normally look at motive. And motive, based on motive, he could deduct that there are two main possible people who could have killed him because they had motive. But that doesn't prove that they did it. So in order to prove it, they need to use abduction to get closer to the truth and to rule out possible suspects and find the actual killer. So that is this is all different ways, and one is stronger than the other, but it also depends on your premises, or what you can put up as premises, or what you can use in order to logically derive at a conclusion. Logic is very important. We looked at empiricism, that is more like the Aristotelian way, and the Cartesian skepticism, which is more the Platonic way. We also looked at the meaning of knowledge. That went a bit too far, and then we looked at the existentialists. And this is actually, if you want to look for parallels between Confucianism and Western philosophy, then the existentialists, the empiricists, are an interesting point to have a look. And last Monday we started with Alain de Botton. I think that Takai-san, you may have been able to follow a little bit. どうしましょうか? Shall we continue where we left on Monday, or shall we start fresh? Alain de Botton.
What level of the discussion we have done on Monday?
On Monday we were talking about Alain de Botton. He is discussing 5 philosophers that show us, give us lessons in life.
He's a newcomer from the south. Otherwise he can follow us.
Okay. So a little bit about Alain de Botton. This is a younger version. The video is rather old. He wrote about philosophy, and Alain de Botton is especially interested in philosophy from a perspective not so much with the philosopher as a starting point, but life questions as a starting point. So if you are confronted with loss, like somebody died in your area, or adversity, or any kinds of questions, what people normally encounter, what would the philosophers advise you? So it is he's taking the opposite approach from most people, and he puts the subjects, us, central in philosophy. He's a very eloquent speaker and very knowledgeable in the philosophy. And he currently actually runs probably one of the most popular YouTube channels. Don't know. It's the life lessons, I think it's called. It's quite popular.
He's not French.
He's Swiss. Swiss. He's Swiss.
What was his thought? You presented 10 minutes.
Yes.
Before listening, can you summarize?
So basically, what he was talking about is his approach to philosophy was more or less about putting. He had chosen philosophers that could answer the questions that people have today. about life questions, and he talks about the Socratic method. I think it's probably a good idea to start from the beginning.
Yeah, just could you summarize?
Okay, yeah, I just tried to do that. So basically, just
because just watching video don't understand. So beforehand, just explain a little bit, then watch video. More better understanding, right? You understand what I mean?
Yes, but summarizing this, we are going to talk about 5.
I know.
Okay, but so all right. So what we will see in the video is Alain de Botton. He studied philosophy. He wrote a book about it with the idea that people can learn something from the philosophers because they have been thinking about these questions very deeply and can give us advice. So he is not describing every theory from start to finish. He is focusing on how we can make philosophy practical, applicable to our daily lives. And this is also something that I think is an approach that Confucius took. He basically describes the road. How should we live without really focusing on do we exist and these kinds of existentialist questions. No, he says, okay, if you want to be a good person, then you have to do this and you have to do that and you should not do this. More practical, less esoteric, but more easily applicable for people. And I think that was what inspired de Botton to actually make all these philosophies more easily accessible to people today, young people today, who are facing questions in their life. So they will discuss about why these philosophers, about the value of philosophy, life questions, and how they should be answered, and about a little bit about a little bit background about the philosophers. Why did he include Aristotle and not Descartes, for example? What made him do that? And so that's the beginning of the video, and then after that they will focus on different questions and look at what the philosophers would have advised us.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get Grammarly.
I write pretty much.
Grammarly is paying a lot for.
And the Socratic method is an attempt to refine rather back. The definition of the project was that it should be philosophers who are concerned with everyday life, and
okay. So this is a book.
Alain de Botton, the author of a new.
This program is a book program. It's very good. I really enjoy watching it. I've used it before. The interviews are extremely good. They ask very good questions. They give a lot of space to the writers. There's very often there are not many views on these videos, but it's actually a joy to watch it, and you get a very good idea of the book. So if you want to take shortcuts and without having to read 2,000 pages, then try to find it on Book TV, and perhaps you will be able to shave off considerable time. So what great philosophers can teach us.
Book, The Constellations of Philosophy. What do you mean by the constellations of philosophy?
Well, it's really alluding to a project that certain
constellations. You know what it means?
Okay.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
philosophers have had in the history of philosophy, by no means all, and that is the idea that philosophy can, in some way, cheer you up, make you happier, console you.
By the way, what does it
that there's a
mean?
practical
Consolation.
application to philosophy.
Consolation.
I know the Japanese word, but what is true meaning? What he said?
The consolations, how it can console us, how it can soothe the pain that we encounter, not the physical
Soothing,
pain.
soothing the pain.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, more of a mental pain.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah, Junshi. About this.
Soothing, soothing,
Junshi.
soothing,
Soothing.
Soothe.
Soothing.
soothe,
Soothing. Make it soft.
soothing pain.
Not smooth, but soothe.
Soothing.
Pain can be hard
痛みの
and
軽減、軽減する。
No. What I'm talking about is the old Chinese philosopher.
Ah.
Junshi.
Huh?
Junshi.
Ah,
it was in your book.
Juice. You're so smart. Did you remember?
Yeah.
Junshi
Oh my
also
God.
talk about the same things. The
Oh
objective.
my God. You
and,
didn't remember my book.
I think his word is also what can I say connect. Yeah. What can I say? Reminds me his word. He also said the same things. Why people have to learn? Because if we face to the difficulties, but not to be the what can I say. What can I say? To be calm and
So.
the issues and seriously, calmly we can solve and what can I say? Yeah, the issues. That
Right.
is the purpose.
Don't get emotional.
Right.
She studied my book.
Oh,
He knows that.
now we all share the same.
My book
purpose.
written in English, so he just studied
Oh,
English.
it worked.
He's smart, yes. I forget that he remembered. I told him, oh my God.
Well, I think I have the benefit that I know very little, so it's easy to remember.
It's a minority school of thought in philosophy, because most philosophers are not interested in everyday life. And yet it seemed to me that there was a tradition of certain thinkers who were concerned, and what I set out to do in my book was to throw a spotlight on their work. They're all major philosophers, but they are often neglected in academic circles. They're not philosophers that one could study, and so it seemed important to shine a light on them.
I should say up front that there are 6 philosophers you focus on,
Yes.
in no particular order: Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Montaigne, Socrates, Epicurus, and Seneca, and we'll talk about each of them. But why did you pick these 6 as opposed to another 6?
Sure. Partly it was because I loved reading them, so it was a kind of personal love affair going on there. Partly also because, as I said, the definition of the project was that it should be philosophers who are concerned with everyday life, and there isn't an infinite range of philosophers. I couldn't have written an essay on Kant within the context of the consolations of philosophy, it seemed to me. So, I think that they came fairly easily to mind, and what's nice about all these philosophers is that they write well, and they're very much united in the idea that it's not just what you say, but how you say it that's important. So they're a pleasure to read.
Are you a philosopher?
Probably not, because I do a lot of writing in other areas as well, and nowadays I suppose the only people who really call themselves philosophers are people on, who earn all their living from doing philosophy, probably in an academic department. Though I have some loose association with an academic post, it doesn't take up enough time for me to stand up and call myself a philosopher. Although, of course, we should take advice from Socrates, who suggests that we are all philosophers and that the unexamined life is not worth living. So, to answer your question Socratically, not only am I a philosopher, but you are too, and everyone else in this room. So, yeah.
And what is philosophy?
Well, I think as conceived of by someone like Socrates, it would be very loosely defined, simply a logical way of thinking. So philosophy identifies itself not so much by its subject matter as by its method, so that it's a method of approaching questions in a logical, rational way, attempting to define terms and to move smoothly from one point to another, etc. So it distinguishes itself from ordinary muddled thinking, in which we don't say what we mean, and talking rather like I'm talking now. So to be a philosopher for someone like Socrates, it just means to make sense and to try and strive for coherence in what one's saying.
Is that what it means for all of these six? Because it sounds like you're saying that philosophy means clear thinking.
Yes. I think all the six throw a different emphasis on certain things. So, for example, Seneca and the Stoic school to which he belonged, he envisaged philosophy as a discipline that's designed to assist you to cope with frustration, and it's his responsibility why we still use the word philosophical as a way to suggest that someone is taking something well, taking a disaster well. I'm being philosophical about the fact that my house has burnt down. This conception of what philosophy is dates back to the Stoic school. So you're right to say that there are differences in emphasis. Although I think all the philosophers I look at are essentially united in the idea that thinking can help in various ways. There are things you can do in your mind which are worth doing.
Comment on my experience, and that is when I was in college, generally speaking, it was the philosophy majors who were pitied as the ones who were wasting their education because upon graduation they would not be employed.
Yes. Well, I don't think the fact that they're not going to be employed is, by definition, means that their course was a waste of time. My criticism of most philosophy courses is that they do concentrate on some pretty arid subjects, and though I think there's a need to study logic and epistemology and metaphysics, I think there's also a need to study kind of ethical questions of everyday life as well, and I think that this is an area that is neglected by most philosophy departments, which is why they unfairly gain perhaps slightly fairly gain a reputation as laughing stock.
You are originally from where?
From Switzerland.
Is there a different approach to the teaching or even the inclusion of philosophy in schooling on the continent as opposed to the United States that you know of?
Not in Switzerland, but I do know that in France, I think when you're from 16 to 18, you are taught philosophy. I'm not sure how much of a good idea this is, because it means that a lot of French people will tell you 5 things about Descartes, which they picked up just before doing their bac. But maybe it's a start.
You've identified some of the aspects of philosophy that are relevant, and they're all listed in the, I guess it's the contents page of your book. You address unpopularity, not having enough money, frustration, inadequacy, a broken heart, and difficulties. Which came first, the philosophers in your mind to address these, or these issues to address these philosophers?
Well, what I wanted to do in my book was not so much write an introduction, a kind of general introduction to philosophy, because that seemed a task that hundreds of others have done quite well. It seemed important to me to drive one question through each philosopher's thought, so not to try and say everything about them, but to try and pick out one consoling dimension to their thought. And really, what it took was for me to read these philosophers and then ask myself, what do I think is really interesting here? What do I think really helps here? So I guess I started with a philosopher and then wound up with a conception of what it was that I felt was really at the core of their work.
Well, let's start then with Socrates, as you did. Who was he? When did he live?
Well, he lived in ancient Athens. He was we know not that much about him because he never wrote anything down. So what we know of him has come down to us through Plato's dialogues. Plato was a pupil of Socrates. He led a very unusual life. He never wore any sandals. It was said that he'd been born in order to spite shoemakers. He wore a dirty cloak throughout the year. It was very rare for him to have a bath. And he was a kind of an outsider figure in ancient Athens. And what he would do is to go up to important figures in the marketplace and basically ask them to explain the meaning of life. And by this, really, one has in mind the idea of someone who is asking people to explain why they're living a certain way. Why is it that they value one thing and not another? Why is it that they're taking something seriously but neglecting something else? He would go up to people and say, explain to me what virtue is, or explain what courage is, or why do you believe that making money is important, etc. And many people were very annoyed by this kind of constant provocation, this need to think about things. But it was essential to Socrates' project. And I think what is interesting about this man, and I think he's the first person to make a distinction, which is key. between truth and opinion. He believed that there is, on one side, the truth, which is something that we've thought about rationally, logically, and have really tried to understand. And then there's opinion, which is our intuition, stuff we pick up in the marketplace. And he believed that philosophy must try to ally itself to the truth, and stand up against mere opinion. So, it's possible to say that 98% of Americans believe X, and nowadays in our own culture we think, oh, well, then X must be right. Socrates' answer would be, well, hang on, what we need to do is to try and systematically analyze what this position is, and it may be that 98% of Americans are simply wrong. So I think he lends us courage to defend certain minority opinions, so long as we've thought about them properly. He lets us imagine that many of the opinions that are dominant in our culture might be wrong, or at least very muddled. And
this is very fundamental belief also held, especially in the Netherlands, where people challenge commonly held beliefs and are encouraged to do so as young people, even in schools. I remember when I was maybe 10 or 11, our teacher brought a newspaper clipping to school about a very popular television show where they're raising money for handicapped people. And we heard about that program. It was too late for us to see it, but we heard about the program. But in that newspaper, some people were interviewed who criticized the program because it didn't take the people with handicap seriously, and they were treated like a welfare case and things like that. And we were actually questioned on this. Okay, what do you feel about this? Because everybody's belief was, well, they're raising money, so how can that be bad? But we were kind of like actively forced to question our commonly held beliefs. Well, what are they complaining about? That we're raising money to actually, okay, maybe there is something to this, and maybe we should revise our beliefs and not automatically assume that even though the group might benefit from it, it might also have aspects to it that are not so good. So this kind of approach, this kind of like independent thinking and questioning the world around you as it happens is very fundamental to our cultural values. I think that is also something that is a difference with Japan, where you're looking for common ground. In general, you're looking. There is a tendency to find common ground in what do we have in common. That means that I know from experience that people from Japan who come to the Netherlands sometimes feel a little bit ill at ease because we try to see very confrontational and question everything, and that it's not a confrontation in itself. It's more of an attempt to get a better understanding and come closer to truth, as Socrates has taught us. So this attitude has its root in Socrates and has been deeply embraced into into the Dutch culture.
What's the difference from Eastern philosophy?
From Eastern philosophy?
What's the difference? You said
common
ground. What?
No. It's okay. So I'm comparing Dutch culture with Japanese culture. I think in Dutch culture we are being taught to question things, to question commonly held beliefs, and to hold, maybe to find, maybe and defend an alternative opinion, which is not mainstream. That is part of our culture. In Japan, on the other hand, there is a tendency to look for common ground. What do we have in common?
Oh, I see. Okay. Why the common ground?
Right. So this is this can lead to frictions between both cultures.
By
This
the
is
way,
what he's proved.
by the way, yesterday I had the chance to attend Japanese education relating people,
Okay.
professors and schoolmasters party, and I discussed with them. And I was working for American company, and those people, pure Japanese society, and they discussed for a couple of hours, but I couldn't understand what they said. I speak an opinion. They will not accept my opinion. Like Trump,
Okay.
like an education system.
Did you give a presentation or was it
No,
just
no,
networking?
Dinner.
Okay.
And I felt isolation. I couldn't join it. It means non-Japanese people attend that meeting, maybe he will going to be isolated. Not the language issue, but this is a different world.
Right. So that is that would not happen in the Netherlands normally.
No.
No. In that case, that's the starting point of a debate. And the debate, because we want to learn, like, how come you think about that, and why do you feel that way? And we would question how you came to your beliefs or understanding, and then maybe learn that your sources would actually be valid, and I would have to end up adjusting my own view about Trump.
Okay, and what I speak at yesterday's party, because like your background is English, but their background Japanese, so their knowledge or information base is different. So they will never understand what you said, and they will go and speak out opinion or not, but in their mind they have some skeptical for your opinion, because the information base is different, the ground base is different. This is big problem, right? And maybe if you're going to join the kind of Japanese party, but they are not tell the true mind what they think, so you cannot recognize what they are truly thinking.
If I were to give them an opinion, would they be prepared to question their own beliefs?
You're going to ask questions and they will never tell the truth, because different opinion. They already, if I'm going to speak out my opinion to Edo never understand what I'm talking about. So even if you stay 10 years, maybe you cannot recognize Japanese people thinking, right?
So Muda. I see.
Or in the case of wife, never talking about the deeper thinking area. Okay, everyday life is superficial. Life, right? You don't need to talk about philosopher. Philosophy, no, it's useless.
Really?
Like my wife. Right?
No, it's not true in my case, but
usually, okay, Japanese people, they don't have a not custom to debate, discuss in deeper thinking.
Right.
So they never thinking about deep thinking. If somebody is studying like Confucianism or somebody is studying Christianity, maybe they can discuss about more deeper source, but usually no.
You know what my experience is Japanese people tend to feel very isolated in the Netherlands. Very isolated.
Why?
So this is actually quite strange, because in the Netherlands everybody speaks English, and a lot of people who live from Japan who come to the Netherlands, they also have quite working knowledge English. But the cultural difference, the cultural gap is too big.
Right.
It's not so much the language, the cultural gap is that we have a tendency, if we have a party, we have a tendency not to have a central discussion, but to have a one-on-one discussion, and discussing topics like maybe like philosophy or things like that, or Trump or politics.
Geert Wilders.
Geert Wilders, exactly. So these kind of discussions are usually not held central, but because central is kind of like finding common ground, right? But we are actually focusing on finding truth in other people's arguments. It's not something that you do in a bigger setting. It's a one-on-one, very much a one-on-one discussion.
Not only Netherlands and all the rest of the world, Japanese society, not isolated. Japanese society, their own group, okay, and they communicate with local people, like in Singapore.
But they also feel. I feel that a lot of people from Japan feel left out. Specifically left out from Dutch society, because I don't feel that they feel welcomed in the discussion, because we don't have like this central discussion. And if
But
there
she
is
got married, local people.
Right.
It's different, right?
yeah, 違う.
違う.
My wife had so much difficulties in the Netherlands because she would not feel comfortable talking with Dutch people.
Why?
Oh, because that like debate, etc., is something that she really didn't like.
Why? She
And then she would kind of like keep the discussion kind of light, but
or like the content, or
the contents.
she don't like the content.
She don't like the content. She doesn't really like the argumentation.
She don't like argumentation.
Right.
Oh.
So but she would feel pressure because other Dutch people apparently like it and like to have discussions like that. And she felt very uncomfortable. She didn't want to go to parties to come.
Oh, I see.
So she,
And Sonoda this morning online that he asked question. He has some professor living in Malaysia. He's Japanese. He's very heavy involved in local society.
Mm-hmm.
But I told him, no, must be careful. Many Japanese is isolated, so he is not so much connection in the deeper into the local society. Must be careful. Singapore is a good example. Many people Japanese there,
right,
but Japanese are isolated and
are
group
small
is,
within.
group independent, right? They are not so much penetrated.
Right.
into
Well,
local
in the
people.
Netherlands, it's definitely true.
Mm.
The Japanese are very isolated compared to other foreigners.
I know the people. I just meet with some yesterday. Meet with the person. He just lived in Singapore and for 3 years. This is famous person. He lived in San Francisco, Silicon Valley for 3 years. He very
Pietro.
no, Jetro. And he's okay. He can speak English and he has a lot of titles. And he's Meti. And so Kyocera. But he's so much arrogant. And I live in America and I have so heavy experience. Oh my God, Santa Beach, just like this. Have a look. Actually, he cannot speak English well. He never involved in local society. Silicon Valley. Right? So I did know that. This one is schoolmaster of the high school. He's a special, specific high school. Yesterday I took dinner with all that.
Smart.
So I felt last night some special feeling. What kind of special feeling? Isolation. Okay, I'm Japanese. Okay, I thought I can communicate with other people. This only everybody educate. This was Chinese restaurant, one round table. Everybody educated.
How did you end up in that group?
Huh?
How did you end up in that
Oh,
group?
this is a Tokyo Industrial University kind of former professor, emeritus professor, organized some event, and some invited persons after speech, and we're going to take dinner every month. But 2 times a year, I just only attend that. Yesterday's guest speaker is Estonia. He some doing bridging Estonia and Japan. So I just attended to only for invitation to take a dinner. I don't feel so much interest in usually speaker. But anyway.
Did he talk about digital government?
No, not this person. Okay, just two tables. We sit table is just university education professors, like schoolmasters kind of people table.
Right.
And they talking about many issues and education method and how they're going to teach them and what is politics and oh my God, what this is a kind of another cosmos. Oh my God, I just at first time I recognized, oh okay, I isolated from this Japanese society. Oh my, what can I do for it? I felt so serious that maybe American people joined that table. I said same feeling they had. I even if they're going to speak English, but really isolated. I'm talking about Trump is a villain. Oh, he is not kind of a wicked person, but those people they don't think so.
They don't think that?
Different way.
Really?
Yeah. Well, Hillary is more worse. Yeah, this is true. But anyway, just they are not accustomed to discuss in deep. Okay? They just sort of the Japanese. He is more well understanding than me, but because he's belonging in Japanese society, I'm not. So they are 2 hours, okay, discussing, but not deep. So that's the reason philosophy is very good for. You told me 2,500 years ago, Aristotle just write a book how to negotiate, how to discuss.
Right.
Sort of things they started at that time, right? Japanese we don't have it, but their discussion is not deep information they have, or they are not interested in deeper thought.
Right.
Maybe you.
So because if your objective is to find common ground, then you are not going to question other people's conviction. You're trying to integrate it into yours. It's a different objective. So basically, it's a matter of agreeing and maybe adjusting a little bit. Whereas the common approach is more okay. So why do you do that? And why do you think that? So truth finding versus how can we work together? How can we integrate our visions and are we on the same page? That means that we can get along. We can proceed.
We don't have kind of culture for discussion. So probably your wife are not interested in that attending a party. She does not want to discuss more.
No.
Right?
No.
They're going to question for you.
Right.
And how do you think?
And then
what do you think?
she completely doesn't play by the rules. Like for example, that if we would have a discussion, then she said, "You're right, but you're not."
Right? So
many
many Japanese don't want to get involved in question or some like a sort of things. If you're going to ask them, they don't want to answer for you.
No.
Right?
No.
So yesterday I just...
But it's also basically a difference between cold reasoning, abstractions, because maybe it also, I'm not saying one is better than the other, because when we are thinking, we tend to think in models, and we tend to think in abstractions and premises and refutes, and that is a construct that we believe to be 100% true. But if you look at it from the perspective of a holistic point, you can say, well, life is not a model. Life is life, and has its complexities and has maybe alternative truths if you look at it from a different perspective. Therefore, don't want to discuss also means maybe the rejection of the concept of thinking through models.
Takashi living in Vietnam, so he's just every day talking with about this issue to Vietnamese.
Mm.
Vietnamese is more closer to American people or European people rather than Japanese. So he is familiar with how to discuss this.
Oh, really? Not like Chinese? More American?
Yeah. Hanoi is more Chinese.
Oh.
Ho Chi Minh is not Chinese. Face is different.
Mm.
Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi is more closer to Chinese. I think the thinking approach is very similar to Chinese, I believe. But Ho Chi Minh is different. Hanoi is more Chinese, but mixing. But not like Japanese. They are more closer to American way of life.
Mm.
But I don't say Japanese they do not think. Oh, they think, but they don't want to debate.
Right.
Right?
Right. Because the rules of debate imply that you need to follow logic. You need to accept on abstractions and say and conclude if this then that. Do you agree? But that's not the way that commonly holistically thinking people approach.
Okay, maybe like that. Okay, just let me try to say. Japanese way is they are not accustomed to accept different thinking way, different method, different, completely different opinion. They are not accustomed to accept.
Right.
They don't open their mind.
Right. Well, nobody will give them a completely different idea or a completely because everybody prior to coming to the table will try already through pre-meetings or whatever get to some kind of common ground and adjust their vision to the extent that they will be able to come to an agreement.
But this guy was Meti, so arrogant.
Meti is also that's like the Freemasons of Japan.
That's right. I don't want to talk with him. I don't want to talk with him. He's okay. He's typical government person. He closed his mind. Okay, with every kind of protection. Never any word listen to me. Looks like listen to me. Any word listen to me. Close heart. Right? Typical. But many Japanese is okay, even if they open mind, but they hesitate to accept the other people's opinion. Okay, why? What? How? They are not interested to think about their mind, right? Okay, let's continue.
Source of great inspiration to people facing opposition throughout the centuries.
What is the Socratic method?
Well, the Socratic method of thinking is really a distillation of the kind of mental maneuvers that Socrates seemed to be engaged in when he talked to Athenians in the marketplace. And really what it boils down to is an attempt to question common sense and to try and disprove it, or at least try and find exceptions to it. So, a typical thing might be, you take a common sense belief like, money will make you happy. Now, the Socratic method would be to take that statement and think, well, okay, can I show any exceptions to this statement? Is this statement really true? Or are there certain situations where that statement will not be true? And one could say, yes, if you've got no friends, but you've got a lot of money, you're unlikely to be very happy. So already there's a kind of, not necessarily that statement is wrong, but there's an imprecision. And the Socratic method is an attempt to refine rather baggy, loose, imprecise definitions that are bandied about in common sense conversations, to try and sharpen them by trying to find exceptions to them. It may sound like a relatively tedious process. In a way, it's common sense, but it's common sense made explicit, and I think that's what we find at the heart of Socrates' conversations as recorded by Plato.
You hear the phrase the Socratic method used most frequently in describing how law school classes are taught. Is that the Socratic method that Socrates himself used, as far as you know?
I don't know about law school classes, I confess, so I don't know.
How did this man make his living?
He didn't really. It's unclear. first of all, he had not very much money at all. It was possible to live cheaply in ancient Athens. Life was not expensive. But he frequently lived off his friends. His friends thought he was the wisest man that ever lived, and hence were keen to, give him food and shelter and help to raise his children. So he did not have a 9 to 5.
Talk about the city of Athens and why this, I guess he just did literally wander around town and he talked to people.
Absolutely.
So why is he now a man that we're now talking about, 2,500 years later?
Because I guess he made some very important points for the first time, and he made them very well, and what he stood up for remains very valuable to us. He's really an emblem of someone thinking independently, someone thinking against the opinions of the majority and the will of the crowd. He's someone who engaged in the questions of daily life. He went out, as you say, into the marketplace of Athens and questioned people, and yet, what he came up with was enormously powerful statements of principle, really, like the unexamined life not being worth living, etc. And this remains applicable today.
And what was his? You mentioned that Plato wrote about him, but what was the relationship between Plato and Socrates?
Again, it's a little bit unclear, but basically we know that Plato was one of Socrates' pupils. He was quite a bit younger than Socrates. Plato is likely to have witnessed the scene of Socrates' trial in Athens in 399 BC, and was very impressed and shocked by the fact that Athens put Socrates to death, famously ordered him to drink hemlock. And Plato wanted to do justice to Socrates' legacy. Plato had been enormously impressed by Socrates' conversations and wanted to record them for posterity, which he did.
Therefore, there's no book written by Socrates.
There's no book, because Socrates' opposition to books is rather interesting. It's not just that he omitted to write books, it's that he believed that there's a problem with books. He believes that what's wrong with books is it's very possible for an author to write a book, but then not be assured of what the reader is taking in from the book. And so one can get a kind of full sense of satisfaction from being a writer. So he believed it's very important to have head-to-head, sort of face-to-face conversations with people, so as to be sure that they are not simply taking knowledge in passively, but engaging with it and taking it in a deep way. And this is why Socrates refused to call himself a teacher. He didn't want to see himself as someone handing down great truths. He wanted to guide people to find truth for themselves rather than simply give them answers. He wanted to set them asking questions, which is why he preferred to describe himself as a midwife. And just as midwives help to bring children into the world, so Socrates saw himself as a midwife of thoughts. He wanted to help Athenians to deliver better thoughts, healthy thoughts.
He seems to be a benchmark of philosophers only because you hear in philosophy about the pre-Socratic philosophers and then I guess the post-Socratic. So why is he that benchmark, and how is philosophy different before him?
Well, Plutarch said that what Socrates' unique contribution was to have brought philosophy down from the skies and to make it mingle in the lives of ordinary Athenians. That was Plutarch's view. And I think that's, on the whole, quite right, that the pre-Socratics are not concerned with questions of everyday life. They're not concerned with questions of ethics. They are closer, I suppose, to what one would now describe as scientists. They're speculating on how the earth works, why the sun rises every morning, what air is made of, what water is composed of, etc. They're concerned really with scientific questions. And then along comes Socrates and brings this kind of more scientific rigor to bear on questions of everyday life. And that is seen as his unique contribution and also his great value.
If we were to run across a real Socrates today, what would he look like, where would he be, and what would he do?
Well, I suppose one thing we could be sure that he'd be doing would be to get us to focus more closely on everyday assumptions. So in that sense, he might have a chat show on TV, but it would be likely to be a rather rigorous conversation in which he would be grilling his guests, not simply in a sort of uselessly combative way, just to help to drive ratings, but in a genuine search for the truth. And one can imagine his programs lasting for hours on end with no commercial breaks as he tries to lead his interlocutors to the truth. So he might not get huge ratings, but I think we can imagine him being, he described himself as a gadfly of Athens, and I think he'd be a gadfly to our own society as well. And he might do this in any number of positions.
Tell the story of his death, the circumstances leading up to it, and the trial.
Right. Well, he was.
And as you do so, I just want to show the audience the picture from your book that depicts his death.
Right, because that is, of course, a famous picture by David, which hangs in the Met in New York. Basically, what happened is that Socrates was called up for trial by a couple of three private citizens who believed that he'd been corrupting the youth of Athens, and they thought that he was an immoral influence on the young and should be tried and possibly put to death. The philosopher had made himself quite unpopular by going up to people and asking them these big questions. He'd annoyed people. One could imagine him being really quite annoying. A lot of the young people had imitated his questioning methods and had gone home and started asking their parents certain things. Why are you living this way? Why is this important? Why not that? And generally, he was seen to be a dangerous influence. Athens had lost a lot of her power in a few years before Socrates was called to trial. Athens had been the loser in the Peloponnesian War, and many people blamed this figure of Socrates, this strange man wandering barefooted around Athens, for basically depressing the young and being a malign influence. So he was called up to trial, and he was accused of all sorts of terrible things. He defended himself in rather a high-handed way. He was told that he could save his life if he stopped philosophizing, if he basically shut up. And he refused to. He said, I must carry on philosophizing. Even if this means that I will die, I must carry on. And because of this high-handed approach, the jurors voted to put him to death. He was taken off to jail, and a few weeks later was forced to drink hemlock, and died a very noble and courageous death, which has continued to inspire painters down the centuries.
And the picture you depict was just one of several that have been...
Right, there are many. There are hundreds of versions of the death of Socrates. In the 18th and 19th centuries, every sort of decent painter would turn out a death of Socrates. This was simply seen as one of the subjects that you would have to turn out, which is enormously moving, really. It's only fascinating to think that the death of this philosopher was a serious sort of obsession for a couple of centuries.
What was the fate of his accusers?
Well, a few years later, we're told by Plutarch that they were lynched, and that they were driven from Athens. Another story tells us they committed suicide because no one would talk to them. Basically, quite soon after Socrates' death, Athens realized that it had made a big mistake. And I think that what's inspiring in Socrates' story is the idea that a belief which at one point is seen as ridiculous and absurd can, within a short amount of time, gradually win people over. And so I think that Socrates lends us encouragement to keep faith with certain ideas, even if at the very beginning, in the short term, no one else seems to agree.
The second philosopher you addressed is Epicurus, and you've associated him with not having enough money. Your book, if we read this chapter, is to console us if we don't have enough money. Who was he? When did he live?
Right. Again, we know very little about Epicurus, just a few fragments. He came about 100 years after Socrates. He was born on the small island of Samos, just off the coast of Turkey, and came to Athens as a young man. What immediately distinguished Epicurus's philosophy was that he said categorically that the most important thing in life was pleasure. And when people heard this, they immediately imagined, they understood what Epicurus had in mind. They imagined him leading a kind of lotus-eating lifestyle and being addicted to luxury and orgies and banquets, because he kept saying the most important thing in life is pleasure. And even today, we have this idea that to be an Epicurean means having a very lavish lifestyle. I recently heard about a deli in Miami called the Epicurean, which apparently serves choice cuts of meat and expensive produce. And there's a restaurant in England also called the Epicurean, a luxury restaurant. So this idea of Epicurus as a promoter of a wealthy and rather decadent life is popular. It's a complete error. Epicurus did say that the most important thing in life was pleasure. However, he believed that if you analyze what truly brings pleasure, it can often be things very far removed from what we imagine pleasure to be when we're reading a glossy magazine. So he stood out against this view that pleasure is easily attained through material goods. And he came up with certain goods which he believed really are necessary for happiness. And fortunately for anyone lacking enough money...
Out there. What is the difference between pleasure and happiness?
Well, Epicurus doesn't make that much of a distinction between the two. Later philosophers have. For Epicurus, these words are interchangeable, i.e. a pleasurable life will lead you to a happy life, and a happy life contains pleasure. So he doesn't draw a distinction.
All right, then you were about to identify certain goods he associated with happiness.
That's right. So you don't need the house, you don't need the big car, you don't need to shop at the Epicurean deli and get the best cuts of meat. What you do need, however, is some friends. He thought it was absolutely essential to have friends. He's rather touching as a philosopher in stressing just how important friends are. He took this insight not just casually or ritualistically, but he took it very seriously in that he himself set up home with a group of friends. He began what I guess could best be described as a commune. He lived with a group of friends. He said that to eat a single meal without a friend is the life of a lion or a wolf. He believed that what makes people human is their capacity for friendship, and that it's the greatest source of our joy. So he began this commune. He also believed that it was very important to be self-sufficient, to lead a self-sufficient life, because he thought that being enthralled to kind of odious superiors can be a serious source of distress. So he believed that we should kind of withdraw from the commercial world in order to set up a commune, what could best be described as a commune. And it's interesting that Karl Marx wrote his PhD thesis on Epicurus, so the idea of an Epicurean commune in which people are living simply but living among friends has had a long hold on, I guess, the Western imagination. The other thing that Epicurus thought was essential is to lead an analysed life. He believed that our anxieties are on the whole disproportionate to what there really is to worry about, and that anxiety is what occurs in the mind when certain problems have not been approached rationally and calmly. So he thought that with a life in which you have friends, you're self-sufficient, and you're doing a lot of analysing, that these are the essential ingredients of happiness, and that if you have these ingredients, that you're lacking the big villa, you can never shop at the Epicurean, etc., etc. This is not going to make you unhappy. Unhappiness is too strong a word for what you might experience if you lack, this kind of luxury. However, he believed that if you do have all the luxury, you have the big car, the big house, blah, blah, blah. He wouldn't have said car, obviously, but you might, that's an extension. He believed that if you had all these goods and yet lacked his three goods, you could not be happy.
Just to put an edge on this, freedom means basically not having a boss, not working in a hierarchy, something like that.
Yes.
And thought means what? That you should meditate every day, or
that you should analyze the sources of your distress. You should analyze all pain.
For example,
Let's imagine that someone is very worried about death. This was a key Epicurean thing. We all worry a lot about death. Epicurus believed that it's very important to happiness to face death head-on at all times, at all ages, and he comes up with various arguments which he believes that if we learn to see death in a certain way, we will stop fearing it so much. He asks us to imagine, for example, that death is rather like the time before we were born. And he says, well, what was so bad about the time before we were born? We didn't feel it, we didn't know about it. He asks us to think that death is going to be the same way, so that there is nothing that we need to fear in death. And that's just one very small example of the kind of attempt to rationalize our fears that Epicurus thought was absolutely essential to happiness.
I want you to analyze two graphs in your book. I have to hold it here so everybody can see, but this one is XY axis, and it's headed relation of happiness to money for someone with friends, freedom, and so forth, the goods you have identified.
Sure.
And this axis, the x-axis, is level of happiness, y is amount of money spent.
That's right. And what we see on the graph is that if you've got these Epicurean goods, and you've got the friends, etc., what you find is that your level of happiness rises very early on in the income scale. You see that there's not that much money that you need before your level of happiness shoots way up. All you need is money enough to buy you clothing and shelter. That's all you need. You don't need anything that expensive. And then Epicurus thought that however much money you have, you don't get more happy. A flat line. So you shoot up quite quickly.
So over here I'm a billionaire.
You're a billionaire, and you're no happier than if
I'm a thousandaire.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
The next chart is the relevant one, related one.
The billionaire.
Yes.
The unhappy billionaire.
The heading is relation of happiness to money for someone without friends, freedom, and so forth.
And what we see is that again, the graph shoots up a little bit when you're able to buy the basics, but thereafter, however much money you have, your graph of happiness stays relatively low, so that the billionaire is not getting much happiness because he's sitting alone in his big villa with no friends.
in the book you mentioned he wrote 300 books, approximately.
Approximately.
How do we know that, and are they real books of the length that you've written and others?
No, they would be shorter because books were shorter. They were scrolls in those days, and so you would have written 350 scrolls, which were described as books. We know this from the biographer Diogenes Laertius, who wrote the lives of the philosophers and recorded many events in Epicurus's life, and so we know this. We also know that the books were largely lost, although a few inscriptions remain and some letters remain.
To what extent do you think that this consolation that you've written is just a way to talk yourself into being happy with your economic failure?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Is this simply denial of our legitimate desire for material goods? Is this simply an attempt to, as you say, feel good about something that that really is necessary? I think that there is something. I think that Epicurus clearly is onto something very interesting. We may not want to drive the argument as far as he did, but it is undeniable that there are plenty of examples of people who have had enormous financial success and yet they're not happy. They have associated a happy life with material satisfaction, and yet there's a problem. I mean, this is almost a cliche of what's happened in Western consumer society, that we place an awful lot of emphasis on acquiring goods, and yet what we find is that our graph of happiness has remained stubbornly low, and this is kind of the great paradox and the great sort of irony of consumer society. What is going wrong? Why is it that people in shanty towns in India seem to be no less happy, it's said, than people in wealthy suburbs of the United States, according to certain research and even if we don't swallow the whole thing, there's definitely something going on, and it's on this territory that Epicurus is interesting and relevant, because he is one of the first people to point out that really that our material desires frequently hide and make up for and disguise certain psychological needs that are unattended, and I think this remains a very relevant point.
Did he lead an aesthetic life, or did he lead one of luxury?
He led, I suppose, a modest life that had certain little moments of luxury. I think Epicurus would have been someone who appreciated the small things of life. So in one letter, he thanks a friend for sending him a feast, because the friend sent him a pot of delicious cheese, which he's just had. So a little bit of cheese was for Epicurus a feast. Other Epicureans were known to have led really quite simple lives, but rather aesthetically attractive lives. So I like to imagine the Epicureans leading a kind of life out of a Dutch still life, sort of modest and simple, but somehow beautiful and aesthetic too.
What would be the Epicurean take on an advertising campaign in the United States that says, it's not just your car, it's your freedom?
Yes, I mean, that's fascinating, because if one reads advertising through an Epicurean lens, one comes up with all sorts of fascinating things. So many adverts, as you say, point out, it will try and sell you a car, and they'll say freedom is the greatest thing, or there'll be there's a perfume called actually Freedom, a kind of aftershave, which is called Freedom, and
I just want to interrupt. From your own book, you've got an example of an advertisement: Bacardi and friends.
Bacardi, exactly. And what you see is some friends having a lovely time on a boat. Now, the Epicurean analysis of that advert is quite simple. What you see in that advert is the way that something that we really need, i.e. friendship, is being co-opted into selling us something that we don't really, so that we'll end up thinking that there is something about Bacardi that is great and that's going to make us happy, because we've essentially been lured to Bacardi by an unconscious recognition that what we need is friendship. The danger is that we'll end up with a crate of Bacardi in our living room feeling quite unhappy and friendless, so we must take care.
The third philosopher you mentioned is Seneca.
So, Epicurus, I think one of the interesting elements here is the fact that Marx studied him in university, wrote a thesis about Epicurus. The consumerism versus the real necessity in life. That's actually before consumerism really existed. Consumerism is something that I'm currently watching a series of videos about marketing and public relations. It's very, very interesting, especially this later thing of tagging products, things that you do not really need by things that you do need, like the Epicurean friendship, or basically living a meaningful life. That is what provides us with happiness. Material things do not do that. That was, of course, a problem in modern society, where we went through industrial revolution. We started to produce all kinds of things, but that could not be sustained if we didn't have the consumer demand for it. So that's when PR consultants started to kind of manipulate our group thinking into ways that people would actually start to buy products by pegging these products to certain beliefs. An example is that the nephew of Sigmund Freud. His name was Edward. Eddie. It doesn't come to mind. Anyway, what he did, for example, he worked with governments to sell certain ideas. He was called the king of spin, but he also worked in advertisement. And one of his assignments was from Philip Morris, the tobacco industry, who told him, like, how come women don't smoke? I mean, we are missing half of the market. Women, because women are not smoking. What can you do to make women smoke? So what he did is he designed a campaign, and because the reason was that women were basically not supposed to smoke. It was not ladylike to smoke. So he designed a campaign where he took some gorgeous women, young women, and let them walk the streets in a parade. He would call up some reporters, and he let those women lit up a cigarette under the slogan "Torches of Freedom." So women's liberation from men, feminism, was linked to cigarettes. Obviously, you don't need cigarettes, but women wanted to identify with that cause of finding freedom. But linking these two together, he was very effective in letting women pick up smoking. So Epicurus would have agreed that it was important for women to gain independence, to get their freedom. But he would definitely, also according to his theory, argue and question the necessity of tobacco to actually achieve that goal.
What kind of soul are you talking about? Human heart?
This is I can't get the name. There is a book called The King of Smoking, tobacco industry.
Encourage women to smoke.
Right. Basically, by connecting smoking with freedom.
Gives them some image.
Right. Put an image in their mind and equating the right to smoke as
So actually they started to smoke?
Yes.
Really? Are you looking for that fruit?
Yeah, the name of the... Edward Bernays. Yeah, that's his name. Edward Bernays. But he also, like PR became a way to manipulate the crowd by giving them a certain image, something desirable, and packing that to products or slogans or all kinds of way how to gain support for policies and things like that. Edward Bernays. It's a very, very interesting video, but it takes 3.5 hours, so it's a very, super long BBC documentary.
It is
Hi.
he valued the effect of friendship
Yes.
for the value of life in proportion of getting the money or the money spent.
Exactly.
So
It says
the meaning of the friendship, are they following some specific awareness to have friendship, to make friendship, being in friendship?
right. So friendship is much more important than earthly goods. So get your priorities straight. Not focus too much on getting material wealth, but the real important things in life are things like friendship. That is more important than having luxury.
It's interesting.
Does he define the friendship in some sort of way?
No. No, I think actually, I don't know if it was Epicurus or it was a different philosopher, but I remember we discussed before about 3 kinds of friendship. There's the kind of friendship where both sides are joining together to have fun. They basically benefit from each other's presence, but that's what puts those people together. That's one kind of friendship. There's the kind of friendship where people benefit from each other, that only exists because of it has benefit, and then, for example, business networking comes to mind, where people get together to enhance their business. And then there is the kind of friendship where people truly commit to each other. The kind of friendship that makes you vulnerable, because it means that if your friend needs help, you need to be there, and you need to sacrifice your own objectives, maybe to support your friend. But it's also the other way around. So it makes you stronger, it makes you more vulnerable. But the really deep friendships are the third type of friendship, where you accept that, and you really come like, well, in America they call it like blood brothers, meaning that this is very deep friendships, and a total commitment to each other, not unlike family.
So could it be created in the relationship of something related to the business, or the friendship is beyond?
I think that this is typically what I would say that definitely yes, because especially in China, what I've learned from Uno-san is that business networking evolves through investment, investment into relationships that go beyond business, because because of this commitment, you're willing to maybe sacrifice a deal to get it and take a rain check on the benefits of certain deals, stick with each other through thick and thin, and build up really long-term relationship that goes beyond the second type of friendship. Whereas in the US, it's very common that those friendships do not really evolve. Most people there are in it for the business, and they go to like weekends and go golfing and get a better relationship, but it's still very clear to everybody involved that this is all about business. It's business networking. It's not a real friendship. But actually, I know a few exceptions of people who are exceptionally good at sales, and what they do well is exactly that point. By taking those networking relationships and bringing and evolving them into really something that goes beyond that. So that requires from professional people to actually go into and invest in a relationship that goes way beyond what is normal in our business culture. I think in Japan, much more so. In China, this is more normal than it is in Europe and especially in the United States.
I mean, the one in Europe is deeper than the one in the United States.
Yes.
And how about Japan?
I think in Japan there is a okay. I think actually in Japan it's also not that common. There is a companionship, but it is based on business. It is based on trusted networks. But it's not personal because it's more business to business. There's no personal commitment involved. There's a business commitment. And people can renegotiate and change their mind and actually lie and deceive and change business relationships. So even though it looks much tighter than business relations in Europe and US, I do not really believe that there are many business relations that are really based on true friendship. Relative to what I expect from what I've learned about China, where this is much more prevalent.
Mm-hmm. So in Japanese the cartoons, do you see any the tendency on the friendship in thinking and actually doing something?
I think that one of the things is that friendship is very personal, right? And business is very impersonal because we are representing something that's bigger than us. That's the company. In Western business culture, it's more of a personal commitment. In Japanese business culture, it's more of of course, on a work level, you need to have a good understanding, but making personal commitments and making it okay with the company, that's usually not something that happens. Do you agree? Because you know much more than I do about this.
Yeah, I do agree. That is the partially because it is not easy to set up the discussion or argument in Japan. Because it's not, if it's personal commitment, we can do it personally, but yeah, it's all representing organization behind us. It's not easy.
Right. So, and if you want to build up a relationship, you will need to be capable of give and take, of saying, okay, Well, I know that you are, for example, in a little bit of a difficult situation at the moment. Maybe your annual figures are not so good. You know what? We do something. We just arrange something off the table. That is not something that is done on a person-to-person level.
So, another question: how is Confucius the teaching how to create the friendship, how to keep the relationship? How is it how is the relationship friendship?
Okay, Japanese and Chinese trust thinking approach is very different. Confucius approach is trust defined more strict and starkly severe. And even if your father killed anybody, but you never prosecute him to the prosecutor, he never tell the truth. This is honest. So trust is also your father tell you anything, but you must be patient. So each other relationship is very strong. Friend to friend is the same.
Even in friendship.
Yes, friendship. Very. For example, Japanese. Okay, if you're going to get acquaintance with Japanese friendship relationship, but time goes by, friendship relationship will going to be changing. But Chinese never change. Even if you don't meet with him for 10 years, but his mind never change. This is Chinese Confucius based. It's friendship and trust. And imperial script in education, this is they are saying like that. But before World War II, we did that. But after World War II, we forget that. So Japanese friendship and trust relationship is loosening, okay, instead of starkly managed. So sort of thing is changing. But recently, I believe that Confucius approach is, I think we try to reconsider. Okay, many people, this old custom, old traditional way, they need to change, but I don't think it's not so much easy to change because they just try to keep kind of traditional way 2,500 years. We need to more seriously consider. One example that I told you, father killed somebody. In this case, son never tell prosecution. Don't do prosecution. Just they trust him. This is honesty. Confucius said. Okay, this is a fundamental friendship relationship. Whatever he did, whatever she did, but you just believe them. This is a way of Confucianism. For recent Japanese is that if we're going to meet each other for next couple of years, they just the friendship break up, more fragile. Chinese never change. This is the Confucianism. So this is based on tradition. Okay, so tradition generate dignity, pride. Recently, Japanese they don't have identity because they lost dignity, they lost pride. This kind of they based upon the groundwork, fundamental has lost. This is we try to revive their tradition. This is very important. And this is kind of sort of Sonoda always talking about. This is not study, not knowledge. This is a kind of framework. Always we need to think about. Always need to make practice. We try to remember your mind. Okay? Are you going to good relationship with your friend, your customer? Always you need to thinking about that. But Chinese is betray you many times because of outset. Okay, at the outset you don't have a relationship with him. In this case, they're going to betray you. But as soon as as long as you're going to build a relationship, they never betray you. This is true relationship. This is trust.
But these kind of trust relationships also exist in Japan, but it's smaller scale, like it's in the villages or within Yakuza, for example. Like Italian mafia is also very much.
Italian mafia is a good example for Chinese Confucianism. Very strict. Italian mafia, okay, just whatever your subordinate did, but both believe him. Okay, so this is a very strict. And Japanese Yakuza is the same.
The same concept found in the daily people living in Europe.
What? What do you say?
How is it in Europe?
Europe?
In Europe, it's no, it's much less.
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's much less.
But even in the business, it's based on.
The business is opportunity driven. It's about the business. We are more American in the sense that our contracts are much thicker than they are in Japan. We would not hesitate to change suppliers if we can get a better deal from other suppliers. It's business. It's business means that basically has nothing to do with friendship. It's business. That's what it said. Exceptional cases that are where you can find a more far-reaching relationship between customers, suppliers, but no, we are also not a trust-based society. We are a profit-based society.
How do you think about that? I'm your customer. Okay?
Right.
Relationship is 10 years, but your price tag is higher than the other company.
Right.
How
I will lose you.
Going to change? They're going to change?
Yeah. I will lose you. If I have a similar product at a higher price, even though they can get the right contractual terms, right, in terms of delivery. So if they can be certain that they can get a similar product at a lower price under similar conditions, my customer will be gone, even though we have 10 years relationship. That's the responsibility of the company to stay competitive. So as a customer, as a supplier, you need to make sure that you keep your customers happy, that you give superior conditions, or in some way, because people, they might feel like, okay, well, they might give you the benefit of the doubt. There is 10 years is not friendship, but it's kind of like trust and experience, and it costs money to change from supplier A to supplier B. But it's business. It's not trust.
Right, and my experience is, okay, just I will submit some job for outside vendor, then they charge 3 times higher than normal. Immediately cut it out.
Right.
But strong relationship, I trusted them very much, okay? But they are sort of, why are they going to charge 3 times higher? But I don't know, but 3 times higher than the usual. And immediately I cut it out, paid them, and just finish.
Right.
But this is just kind of beyond trust.
Right.
A sort of betrayal.
Right, betrayal, yeah.
That's
Yes, betrayal. Yeah.
Understandable. But this is very, usually customer are going to order the producers, even if certain level of price tag is higher, but he is going to be patient. This is trust relationship.
Right.
But like 3 times it's cut it out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So
but Japanese is very weak for trust relationship.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
They change in the next 2 years. They change mine. Okay.
But
yeah, consider about that my environment, or your environment, company environment, business and economy are going to change, but Japanese is going to change their mind. Chinese never change their mind.
Why do you think it's
Oh,
different?
this is Confucianism teacher. Must
No,
be.
no. I'm very curious. Why you think that trust
Yeah, I think
exists?
He's a master.
I think the Japanese business style.
You speak,
is,
come closer, otherwise no, your voice not coming.
so Japanese business style is traditionally the trust-based one, and but this situation is drastically changing right now, especially after World War II. But before World War II and after the Meiji Restoration, or maybe including Edo era or whatever. So
Oh, before
we
that,
are-
no, we are talking about now.
now we are losing, and I agree with Ando-san.
He is
And
talking
more,
about
we are now
Edo era.
shifting from a trust-based to the contract-based,
Right.
like European.
Yeah, but still,
Oh yeah.
I'm still like shocked how thin
Oh yeah.
the
yeah.
contracts are and how
Right,
little
right, right.
specification
Yeah,
there
if
is.
If we compare with the Japanese situation and the European situation, that's true. Relatively speaking, it is yes.
Still not even
Yeah,
comes
from
close.
your the criteria.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Still the Japanese
This-
situation is more trust.
The
trust-based.
soft unspoken elements in a Japanese business agreement are so much bigger than they are in Western society. There are much more things specified, and penalty clauses, and also project definition. What exactly are we going to do?
Yeah.
What are your responsibilities? My responsibilities? What are we going to deliver? What are we going to do
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
don't deliver? That everything is
Yes,
part of
so-
the business agreement.
So that.
But is that a matter that doesn't exist in Japan? Is that based on trust, or is that based on ethics? Does that define your brand value?
Yeah, I think both there may be the both views. Maybe trust or maybe the brand but I think both of them are based on some common ideas or attitude or way of thinking or whatever. And one of the philosophy which produces that kind of base is the Confucianism, of course. And I give you one of the big example is Keiretsu or automotive industries. And one of the success king of the Keiretsu is the Toyota,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And Toyotas have been succeeded based on their the Keiretsu style
Right.
contract.
Nissan did.
Yeah, they changed drastically
Right.
after he came in.
Yeah. Carlos
Yes,
won.
yes.
Yeah.
So that Nissan is another, I think, good example. Even if we shift to the contract-based business, but still it is possible to win.
Right.
And but let me finish. And Keiretsu is one of the example. And I give you also another example, which is based on my experience. This is an example of the plant construction project, comparing with the overseas project,
Right.
domestic.
Right.
And talking about always the project management is issue, and if regardless of the domestic or overseas, anyway we make the temporal team for the project, and we sent the chairman of the project of the construction site.
Right.
And but the required nature for the such kind of project manager is totally different between the overseas project and domestic.
Right.
And the domestic project, it's much easier for the project manager. They only can come to the office and reading a newspaper whole day, and after 5 o'clock, let's go to drink. That's all. Because everything is connected with based on the trust. Even if we could not give them the very specific authorized drawings, but still the workers or construction contractor can construct by their own decisions or sairyo, what can I say? So that there are, so that if we see the relationship between we EPC contract and for suppliers and the local suppliers or local constructors, the relationship is a very kind of a loose from the aspect of a contract. But very we can okay say anyway complete the project in a shorter time, in a cheaper price, always. But if we see the overseas project, that doesn't work.
No.
And we need the different type of the project manager for the construction site, and they require much more skills to project management. And of course, the fundamental requirement may be let's say one of the fundamental requirements is understanding the, for example, the ISO 9000 or the project management, knowledge of body or such kind of a Western style, the very specific, very accurate control of everything.
Right.
Yeah. So that if we look at the situation in Japan, the reason why almost all the domestic projects will be completed without any issues, problem, even if we don't have a very detailed contract, is because we share the same common backgrounds about the way of living or whatever. So that no need to say detailed things. But if we go to the overseas project, we have to say everything from the detail by detail.
Yep.
So that we are not.
And you need to sign it off, otherwise you will actually end up paying for it, or will be sued, or
yeah. And most of the cases which the Japanese company failed came from that point. Bad project management.
Yeah. Toshiba.
Yeah, Toshiba is one of the bad worst example.
Right.
Yeah. So that in past we could manage our business based on the trust. But most of the business are carried out in domestic. That's
okay, but how do you since projects also means that there are is there always a thorough plan? Is there always a thorough blueprint of for example, if you involve construction, I guess there is. You have a drawing, and you have a very specific work allocation document. Okay, this supplier is going to be responsible for this, that, and that, and they need to complete by this time, and then the other needs to come in and finish, and the specs of what needs to be delivered is everything is specced out, or
you're talking about the domestic.
Let's say a domestic high-rise building.
Yes, of course it depends on the project. There's an easy project also to the very, very difficult project. And if the project becomes bigger, of course even if we we depends on the trust-based business, but of course we give them, and we carefully plans everything if possible, and as much as possible. But still there is the some portion which is controlled by or managed by the trust between or among the consortium or whatever. And for example, logistics is one of the, I think, a good example. In the case of Japan, very land is very narrow, so that there's no big space to stock the parts. Like if we try to build super high buildings, so that in such a case, that is one of the example of the Toyota Kanban hoshiki.
Mhm.
So that how can I say? At this moment, we are planning the logistics, the strategy using tools and in a very specific way. But in past, it is up to the suppliers or whatever. They themselves think about what is the best, what is the optimum way. So that
how common is it that you work with fixed price projects, fixed price contracts on these kind of, like, let's say, for example,
you mean a percentage?
A fixed price contract means that basically you commit prior to the contract to a fixed price. Is that common?
Now it is common.
Oh,
So
okay.
in the field of plant construction, we say EPC contract. So that we we got the project in a specified price.
Right.
And from the aspect of customer, you can do this project with this the budget.
Right.
And if you can finish earlier, then you can the remaining part of the budget
Is
will be yours.
Profit.
Plus bonus.
Uh-huh.
That is now common. But if we complete successfully, then we need, of course, the very detailed planning is required.
Right.
And in overseas project, EPC contract style project increases drastically.
Right.
Yes.
Right. It happens a lot, but usually what happens is that if there's little budget, the scope of the project is usually underscoped. So the delivery comes, the customer is confronted with the solution and realizes that this is missing, that is missing. Yeah, sure. It's not in the contract. So we can do that, but can you please make more budget to actually have that included? Because we clearly...
Yes, so that in the case of EPC contract, the one of the most important thing is to exchange a very, very detailed the specifications from everything, project management, logistics, whatever, blah, blah,
right.
blah, blah. And what is in the contract, and what is out of the contract.
Right.
But this portion is exactly the portion which the Japanese company is weak. They kind of lose relatively from the aspect of European companies.
I understand that the agile projects are still very rare in Japan.
Agile.
Why is that? Because actually it would fit.
Agile means...
Agile basically means that you work from the understanding that you do not have 100% vision of the solution. And actually it is dangerous because your business might change, your requirements might change during the project. Therefore, if you are going to make everything specified and put everything in stone at the beginning of the project, that means that you cannot change anymore during the implementation. So Agile works from the understanding that you work with like short projects in the middle, and basically there's a very close collaboration between customer and supplier, and you are basically working together side by side, making this project happen. And after a month you review, you see how far you are from the objective solution, and that's how you do it. But it gives you flexibility to actually build something that meets your business needs, instead of making a commitment for a project that's going to be finished in 5 years. But it could very well be that your business requires a completely different solution at that time, because there could have been innovations or whatever that other people have adopted that renders your entire solution useless in the market. So this is something that has become very common in the Western world, but not in Japan, which I think is rather surprising because I think the culture kind of leads itself to it.
I think you're talking about what do you say, payment, progress based payments.
Yeah, it's a little bit. It goes a little bit beyond that. Time material is what we call those kind of projects. That's basically the supplier doesn't take any responsibility. Whatever we do, we just send you an overview of the hours and the cost that we made, and you just need to pay it. That's time and material. This is a little bit different in the sense that there is actually very little definition at the beginning. The contracts can be thin. Basically, you describe your vision, and then you start defining a very small project, maybe a month or 2 months worth, and it is basically made as you grow with all the people who use the end product involvement. They give you requirements and they give you input, and then it's called a what's it called? A sprint. Sprint after sprint after sprint. You deliver. You have a 2 months delivery responsibility, and that's how you grow your solution and make sure that it keeps following your business needs.
And the question is,
why doesn't so is that
in Europe it is a common.
Yes,
but in
it
Japan,
has become very
not so common.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
I don't understand what agile project. You mean project does not specify 100%?
Yes.
Yet.
Yeah.
And in progress, they're going to define which direction.
Exactly.
It's kind of sounds like R&D style.
Right.
Yeah. So
More.
it is. If it is a pure R&D the project, then that kind of agile type.
It's actually
possible.
mostly can be mostly applied in software development.
I've never heard of
Oh, no, it's I think it's maybe the most used project management methodology in software development in Europe at the
it.
moment.
Japanese company so risky.
Mm.
They are in the budget very rigid.
Right.
So they will not accept kind of flexible project.
Mm. I hear now that consulting companies are starting to look for people who can work agile, and they can't find them in Japan.
Maybe now is, but my experience is more than 10 years ago. But now is they accept kind of project, but I don't know.
I think especially talking about the business field of software product. I think still even software developer in Japan also still live on the old style, waterfall style,
Right.
Development, I guess.
Right.
So that is the reason, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's go a little bit back. So we were talking about trust. So is the Japanese business culture a trust-based culture, or is it a reputation based? So basically,
What do you mean?
is the reason why I stick with supplier A? Is that because supplier A always gives me superior solution, or is that not always necessarily true? But is the reason why I stick with A because I trust them, or because the brand reputation of A is such that if A screws up, I will not be blamed because I chose A as a supplier? What drives the decision to stick with A? Is that trust in A, or is that the fact that I will never be blamed if I stick with A?
Always we Japanese lived on the idea of Confucianism, and one of the key factors, for example, loyalty or like I say, honesty, and we always, regardless of the business or friendship or whatever, we always put the most importance on those virtues, 5 virtues, so that in past. It was okay when such kind of virtue worked well, because there's no distinction between the friendship and the business.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But now situation or environment is now changing, so that of course we have to adapt the change of the environment, business environment, and also such kind of a virtue only works between between the Japanese. But if we have to communicate with the overseas customers, we once forget about those things, and we have to hire the new way. That is a contract based.
Right.
But still, we have a tendency to rely on such kind of activity, because we lived on it for a long time, so that it is difficult to change that in a drastic way, even if we knew logically.
Is that why many many Japanese companies who try to engage in foreign M&A fail?
I don't have some kind of a statistics numbers, but I feel like most of the company have been failing. The M&A of the overseas companies. There are a variety of the reasons, I guess, but I have no idea about the truth is, we are failing.
In Europe, in the Netherlands, that there are no's for sure, but I think it's an international phrase. We say business is business. Business means it's different rules apply. This is a different world. That means that it's not about your blue eyes and whether your son goes to school with my son. No, this is about business. So that means that it's not. It's about the numbers. It's about who brings me the superior solution against the best terms. That is business. So for us, trust carries only a little weight.
Yeah. Early stages in Meiji Restoration, there was a very famous Japanese businessman. His name was Shibusawa Eiichi, and that was rise of the modern Japanese business and industry. And of course, he was born at the end of the Edo era, and he learned during the Edo era, and also he also lived in the early Meiji era, and he insisted that business still require the moral or virtues, and which is based on Confucianism.
Right.
He wrote a book about Confucianism and abacus. That is one of the very famous book. And the interesting is, have you read about the Peter Drucker's management?
Yes. But the summary.
Huh?
The summary.
Well, anyway, there is essential. You mean an essential version?
Yeah. So I read all kinds of things because I had to study.
Okay. Now there are many the business management people, Japanese business management people exist who really love the Peter Druckers.
Right.
And many people try to refer his word from his book, Management. But if we read through the management carefully, even the essential version, Peter Drucker referred so many ideas from Shibusawa Eiichi. And one of the European researcher wrote one the article that the fundamental philosophy behind the idea of the Peter Drucker was the Confucianism.
Well, I think actually, didn't he spend some time in Japan?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe that because of that, but so what I would like to say is what the Peter Drucker said about the business is very close to the idea of a Japanese old style. I don't want to say old, but the business style we Japanese already did in past.
Right.
Traditional.
So that's why his style, the Shibusai Eiichi's style, was called the Japanese capitalism. So the capitalism idea is slightly different from the European type because business, the money is of course important, but not only the money, but the loyalty, trust, honesty, whatever.
Okay, but so then, if you have to choose, if I would give you a choice, trust is central to business, or trust is a very important attribute to business? What would be the most accurate description for Japanese business? Is it central to business, or is it a very important attribute to business? Trust, is that central to business? So, can you do business? Is it a condition? Is it conditional to do business to have trust, or is it a very important factor? Trust, but another factor is price and quality.
I think there is no clear borderline between
In Japan or in
Japan.
In Japan, okay, core.
in core.
So according to Una-san, it's core. How would you-
Yes, but still there is some flexibilities, and some company take the trust as the attribute for the business, but some other Japanese company working for the trust, not for the money. So for such kind of companies, trust is the center of their business. Okay. And there are several such kind of companies now and still now. And interesting is the most of those companies have a very long history type company, established in more than several hundred years ago. And also there is another statistics number that Japan is the number one the nation which have such kind of shinise, the company which have a long history.
Longest life. So.
And the second is China. But
so basically, trust is also means good business.
Good, yeah, and or even some company is still working for the trust first or honesty first, and because there is also such kind of saying, which came from Confucius idea, but sengi kori. Sengi means gi righteousness first, and benefit after.
Okay.
And this is a very well-known kind of a slogan or whatever. Every time when we think about the business or earning money, you should not think about money first. You should think the righteousness. Okay. And of course, it is not possible to live along this slogan always for every company. But for example, one of the Japanese company which is producing very special sort of the product for the disability people. That company is in Kure, Hiroshima. The name is Happy Ogawa. And at the very first moment of the establishment of the company, their situation was very, very terrible. But anyway, the founder started that business only for the disabilities people without the care, without thinking about how much they might be earn.
Right.
but eventually their, like I said, benefit.
Followed from their business ethics.
Yeah, now they are earning a huge amount of money. And such kind, there are many such kind of company in Japan, and also there are the book which introduced such kind of a company. And one of the famous professor of the university is Koji Sakamoto, Hosei University. He wrote the several books about such kind of Japanese company. Yeah.
How does this relate? How does it fit in with the tendency that we see now that a lot of Japanese businesses try to outsource business processes to overseas, set up foreign factories and work together with foreign suppliers? Building trust relationships is much harder. They make themselves more vulnerable for their suppliers. Does it mean that there is a concession to trust, or does it only carry so far? Because I see that this is basically that will give them more benefit because they can produce at lower costs, for example. But it also destroys the supplier-customer relationship with their previous suppliers, with their own lifetime employees. Makes them more vulnerable for not reaching the quality levels, delays, etc. Is this a shift in business attitude, or is there how do these two trends?
Yeah, that is I think a big issue for the Japanese company who try to do the overseas business. And I myself think still we are in the transition period from pure Japanese style business to the Western style trust contract based business. Because as far as we share the same philosophical background, that kind of Japanese style business can succeed. But if we are not sharing such kind of background, we have to change the strategies.
Right.
So that now most of the Japanese companies still struggling to transfer from original Japanese
way
to
global
universal kind of universal way. But at the same time, even if we do the overseas project, but we would like to bring some important essence to the overseas the business,
right,
which we did in past.
Well, there is a tendency to bring a lot of foreign of Japanese business relations with you when you go overseas, right? I was at Ernst & Young, and I understand that their consulting business, they have only at Ernst & Young Japan, but their consulting business is 50% in Japan and 50% outside of Japan. But that 50% out of Japan is 100% Japanese businesses who are going overseas and need support with their accounting, with their negotiation and everything else, everything that goes with it. So that kind of like hanging on to relationships, but basically bringing them outside of your country, that supports the idea of being able to trust and do business smoothly and maintain that trust base in your business. The other hand, it really destroys the opportunity for businesses to grow local relationships and build up local trust, new trust relationships, and really get to know your customers and actually develop the country where you're at into with new business opportunities. So what I see is that trying to hold on to this business ethics doesn't stop you from globalizing, but stops you from becoming global.
You mean the business going to take out from Japanese market to bring to overseas.
Right.
So they're going to lose trust.
Yeah, so, but what they do to compensate for that is that they bring a lot of their Japanese suppliers, like accountants and other specialists, with them to Singapore, to China, to what have you.
With them.
So let's say company X is a manufacturer, a car manufacturer. Let's say a car manufacturer. They work normally with I don't know, Anderson Consulting or Accenture. What they do is they go to China, but then they bring Accenture with them.
You mean
in Japan?
hire work employees?
No, I mean that they're suppliers. They're because Japanese companies work more easily under the Japanese business ethics. That they collaborate rather easily instead of working with foreigners. That's more risky. So what happens is that they go overseas, but they actually bring their accountants and their other suppliers with them into the foreign country, and they create their own community there in order to maintain those trust relationships and to maintain that traditional Japanese way of doing business. The risk there is that they do not depend and do not interact with local suppliers, and therefore they never get a good understanding, a good feeling with the local market.
You said accounting?
Yeah, for example. Yeah.
But the car manufacturing going to the States or going to China, in this case, they take many subcontractors to
With them.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But the Japanese ones. Yeah.
But Volkswagen, they cut it out.
Exactly.
That's the reason the Japanese car problem in China. They try to ask for the subordinate company, subcontracted company. So they like Volkswagen spread all over China who try to get supplier. But Japanese car company just only that's only small location and buying high parts cost. So because they try to keep connection with those suppliers.
Right.
But this is I think this is not good. And,
right, but it's also difficult to completely let go of the fundamental. But what you both said is fundamental.
If I go suggest car makers in China, they take supplier, subcontractor, bring to China is okay. Problem is they can't speak Chinese well. Problem is supplier going to ask for third vendor, they can't make it. They try to. They do not believe local supplier quality. But Volkswagen, they don't do that. Spread all over China because of past buyer moving around China. Okay, take suppliers, bring to China, no problem. Toyota bring and everybody bring to the supplier to China. This is no problem. But also they need to buy parts spread over China. They don't do that.
Right. But I see that there's another fundamental problem in that on the one hand, yes, you can operate your business. On the other hand, you become an island in a foreign sea instead of that you become a part of the new country. So you do not build up relationships with local suppliers.
Exactly. My friend, I went to build a factory in Malaysia. I told the recommendation you should involve local people.
Right.
They didn't. They just only the worker hire local worker, but senior member they not to hire. Only Japanese.
So they have no idea about the market there and the possibilities, and they don't have any relationship.
Right. But so they lost opportunity.
Right. I think you need to save the video. No? ちょっと